Hello everybody and welcome back to the second to last episode of Warptorio. As the final project in this series, I wanted to see how much science we can produce while limiting ourselves to just the warp platform. Initially I wanted to go for a very nice round number of 10,000 science per minute, but very soon realized that that is not possible, and on further investigation, I ended up setting the target for 6,000 science per minute. And while raw resource-wise we are fully set up for this, there is one project that will require our dedicated attention, and that is to obtain 11,000 warp modules. And although this won't make much difference space-wise, I have decided to change our smelting to use warp modules as well, primarily to reduce the amount of resources our bots will have to carry around. And let's take a quick look at the warp module build. We'll need a total of 824 assembly machines, 1700 electric furnaces, 44 chemical plants, 6 refineries, and a whopping total of about 7k warp modules themselves. And because we're going to clean up the entire floor, mall included, I want to stockpile some items, the main one being 10k logistic bots. I'll also request some assembly machines, inserters, and blue and green chests. Next thing is to limit the smelting chests, both input and output, to a maximum of 200 items. This is a very tedious operation, but it will reduce the lag in the system and it will allow me to spot issues with the build faster. At the same time, it will also allow for better resource distribution by bots. I am applying the same limit to the iron smelting section, but here I also need to convert some of the stone smelters to iron, keeping just enough of them so I don't have to change again once we're done with warp modules. We have plenty of resources, so I'll just rocket all the chests with stone and stone bricks away so the bots don't have to move all of those resources. I just need to make sure that I have the correct number of iron, copper, and stone smelting furnaces here. The remaining stone and copper smelters get the same limit, and no need to adjust the number of copper smelters here. I also have to clean up the buffer chests for coal and stone, and I choose to destroy them for the same reason that I've done so with the stone chests previously. While doing this, I realized that some of my production chain is not working and the robot frames are entirely dead. Upon taking a closer look, I noticed that the platforms were upgraded for the final time and I didn't actually reset the pipe position and the chest requirements. So I take a very short break from destroying chests to fix the oil and water input to the factory floor. Now that that's out of the way, I can finally destroy the last chests holding stone and stone bricks. After the bots finish picking up the last red chests over here, I'm going to head up to the rocket silo and remove all the inserters. I don't want any more space science to be produced as we already have quite a bit in excess. One last thing on the factory floor is to make sure that no more raw resources are coming in. And I'm gonna do that by closing up all the spots in the red chests that the train used to inject resources into the factory floor. Finally, I go down to the harvester floor and apply the same resource storage limit as we've just done on the factory floor. And that's it, we're done for now. No need to adjust the boiler floor, as adding warp modules means that we need to redesign them ground up anyway because of the productivity bonus on the iron smelters. The next big item on the to-do list is to clean up the factory floor. This will actually have to be done twice, once for the warp modules and once for the 6k science packs. So I will go a bit overboard with the number of yellow chests that I am going to set up. And luckily I have this one tile space on the edge of the smelting floors where I know I'm not gonna use them for anything, and I think that this is the perfect place to put these chests in. As you might have noticed, I still have a few of the old vanilla roboports in the center of the area, and that's actually one of the main logistic nodes on the whole factory floor, so I am gonna spend a bit of time to remove those and get a few warports, get as many of them as I can to make sure that the robots have a place to charge up. I do want to set up one last thing before I issue the deconstruction command. I want to make sure that we always have enough logistic bots in the system. I actually do not know exactly how many I'll need to be able to support full throughput. And as such, I'm gonna set up an automated condition so that whenever we go below 500 bots, we will always be top. And there we have it. Goodbye old base, you shall be missed, but it's time for the new. And after I did spend a bit of time trying to carefully plan the deconstruction planner, I do realize that I have missed quite a few crucial things. One of them being the arithmetic combinators that are required for the Warptorio fuel to be transported between floors. Now, this had another issue as well, where when the warp floors reset, I forgot to reset the requester chests to automatically read the signal. So I will spend a bit of time over here rewiring all of those up, hopefully for the last time, as I don't think there's gonna be any more factory floor upgrades. I really wish they would remember the settings though, that is quite inconvenient. But as we witness the bots slowly but surely removing every single item that we have on our factory floor, we can now start placing a bit of the power grid as guidelines. Now I think I might be misaligning some of them just by 1 or 2 tiles, but the purpose of this is to get a sense of where the grid is and to actually start building around that grid. And with that out of the way, let's finally start building. I will follow a similar pattern to the one that we've used for the previous design, and thanks to Helmod we have a nice list of everything that we need to lay down. For most of the list here, with just one exception, I will be following a top-down build. So the first item on the to-do list is going to be the warp module factories, for which we need 2 of them. For almost everything in this build, I already have a pretty good idea where they need to go. That is, except for the red chips, which will act as a filler, and I really hope we'll have enough room for all of the factories. And you know what they say about hindsight? I am starting off this build by doing something wrong, something that's gonna take me quite a while to correct and realize. But the warp module assembly machines actually need 3 input chests because of the sheer number of resources that just one module requires. In terms of chest setup, I will set the outputs to 200 items per pair of factories, and in most cases I will leave the inputs to the default copy-paste values. Now, there are a couple of exceptions around that for high throughput items like copper cables and electronic circuits and maybe even plastic, but we'll get to that a bit later. The next part of the build is probably the most boring out of everything that's left. We have 9 recipes that are pretty standard. We've done these types of recipes already countless times in this playthrough. I am obviously talking about the tier 1 to tier 3 speed, productivity and efficiency modules, which only require 1 input chest, 1 output chest, and we have a 3x2 space in the middle where we can place either a warp port or a substation. The one thing that I do need to be very careful about is getting the output inserters limited properly, as you've just seen me correct that on the warp module builds as well, and also making sure that the buffer chests do have the correct requests set on them. The ratio that I'm gonna use is 36 tier 3s, 38 tier 2s, and 32 tier 1s. I could go a bit lower for the tier 1 and tier 2 modules, but I want to keep even numbers. This might cause a bit of a buffer lag, but I'm pretty sure it won't impact the system that much. In terms of the actual placement of these factories, you're probably seeing me going all over the factory floor, and I did experiment with quite a few setups. In the end, I think that this was one of the better ones. There are a few small improvements that can be done, but basically what I've tried to do is minimize the flight time that the bots need to do to get from supply chest to demand chest. And there's quite a few interdependencies. This is definitely not the most optimal, but it is something that I was quite okay with. In the end, what matters more than the location is getting the actual number of factories correct, and that's why you're gonna see me counting them every time I finish setting up one of the recipes. Up next is one of the more interesting builds that we have to set up, and that is the blue chip production. What I think makes this build more interesting is the fact that we have fluids and we cannot just use bots to transport those. We actually need to manage pipes, and pipes are quite bulky. And also the fact that we need a total of 137 of these, which surface-wise I think this will be the most space-intensive build that we'll have to do. And just because of that, you're gonna see me like the way I'm setting up these inserters right now. Not actually following the pattern, but I am trying to squeeze as many factories per tile as I possibly can. And as you can see, I even need to do a bit of creative pipe pathing so I can get the maximum out of this space. I do not want to go too much to the right because that space is dedicated for plastic. The west factory bridge is going to be filled with blue chips only, and for this one we will use the 9 factory pattern that I've used in previous builds. We'll have a pipe running through the middle and chests at the top and the bottom. The chests will be shared between adjacent blocks. Also, the 10th factory is going to be replaced by the connecting underground pipes. There's also gonna be a pump placed here to make sure that the sulfuric acid will make it all the way through to the very end of this huge build. And I do want to fully utilize the space here, so I will also make use of the 3 segments connecting the factory floor to the bridge and to the gigafloors. With that, we are down to just 40 more assembly machines left to be placed down, and I believe that they will all fit snugly in the southwest corner of our bridge. I am going to opt for a horizontal build in this corner as opposed to the northwest corner, which we did a vertical build. And while the corners are square in shape, their center is actually not, because that's a 3x9 block that is unusable. For the top corner, going the horizontal build would have been a bit more problematic because of reasons that you're gonna see in just a few minutes. But for this corner I did go with a horizontal layout because it is slightly easier to set up and it will allow us for just a few more machines if we really needed that extra space. And once the final pipes and all of the substations are in place, we have finally completed. We have placed down 137 blue chip assembly machines. Up next is one of the layouts that I am not entirely happy with in the whole build that we're doing here, and that is the layout that we are doing for the green chips. I am using the same pattern as in all other places, 2 assembly machines on the side and a row of chests in the center. The buffer chest follows the same pattern that we've used in all other places, 9.2k for an item that stacks up to 200 items. The problem comes when we have to set up the requester chests. Now, for a setup like this, we have space available for 3 chests. One of them needs to be the output chest, the other up to 2 can be input, or vice versa. And while without having all 4 warp modules inserted, we will be okay. The 4th warp module actually puts us just 4 items above what a fully upgraded green inserter can actually input for a single resource type. And while having 2 inserters will theoretically put us way above the required number of inputs per second, there are times when both inserters will pick up the same item and as such will not be able to deliver all required items to keep the assembly machine functional. On the other hand, separating the 2 input resources in separate chests we've just established that is not viable, and because of the number of assembly machines required, we cannot break the pattern and go with 3 input chests per assembly machine, so we will have to take the trade-off of having the machines not work at full capacity, just slightly below it. For this build, we only require 3 assembly machines producing LDS. We're gonna use 4, but we're very quickly gonna get that out of the way and we're gonna move on to copper cables. In some regards, the setup is going to be fairly similar to electronic circuits in the sense that we'll also need 3 input-output chests for this to work, but the ratio here is going to be 1 input to 2 outputs. If we take a closer look at a fully modded assembly machine, we're gonna see that we need almost 70 items per second output, which is very close to what 2 fully upgraded inserters can keep up with. And because in vanilla Factorio the copper cables are the highest throughput item in the game, I'll also adjust the buffer sizes here to be more than 200 so that bots can properly keep up with the demand for green and red chips. We require 64 assembly machines for this to work, and that should be the exact space that we have available at the bottom side of the factory floor. Although chemical plants have a slightly different pipe position when compared to an assembly machine, I am gonna use a fairly identical layout between plastic production and blue circuit production, and that is 1 pipe input in the middle and input and output chests on either side of the assembly machine. And given the fact that the plastic is also a fairly high throughput item and also it is going to be located fairly far from the red chip production, I am also going to increase the buffer size for plastic up to 600 items. Among other things that I'm really gonna be looking forward to in Factorio 2.0, one of them is the ability to be able to flip blueprints containing chemical plants. As you can see here, I am really annoyed by the fact that you cannot even flip very basic blueprints containing chemical plants. This one has no connections, no dependencies, it should be an extremely easy flip. The solution that was presented in the Friday Facts newsletter was, I would say, quite obvious, and I really don't understand why the devs didn't just implement that in the initial version of the game and we have to wait for Factorio 2.0. Rant aside, one of the places where I had to get a bit creative with pipe pathing was for the top 4 chemical plants. The most obvious way to get petroleum there is actually blocked by the sulfuric acid that needs to go through to blue chips. I also have to use quite a lot of pumps because the petroleum that's going to be required for this build is very close to 2k per second and we need to make sure that the pressure is kept up, otherwise the system is going to back up. Next up is sulfur and sulfuric acid, and this is going to be quite a straightforward build as we require less than 1 chemical plant each to be able to sustain the whole build. Probably the biggest challenge here was to figure out a nice way to integrate these 2 chemical plants, or should I say the pipes coming into and going out of these 2 chemical plants, with what's about to come in the next part of the build. And speaking of the next part of the build, I am obviously referring to oil processing here. This will require quite a few factories to be put in a fairly narrow space, and we have a total of 6 refineries, 4 chemical plants for heavy oil cracking, and a total of 15 oil plants for light oil cracking. The oil refineries themselves have a pretty standard layout. We have 2 pipes at the top carrying in water and oil. There's the 5 rows that are required for the oil refineries themselves. And then we have 3 output rows for light oil, heavy oil, and petroleum. The heavy oil is not that far from standard either. It's only 4 machines, there's no problems with throughput, and we've actually managed to squeeze those into one of the small gaps connecting the bridge to the mega floor to the north. The bigger challenge here was to actually place down the chemical plants for the light oil cracking. And one of the reasons for that is because the space underneath the refineries are just 1 tile short to be able to have dedicated space for inputs and outputs. Fortunately, I was able to find a setup where I could share the light oil pipe acting as an output for the refineries with the input pipe for the light oil cracking. But the challenges don't actually stop here, because surprisingly or not, with all the extra productivity that we have from the central beacon and from the warp beacons, light oil cracking is actually the main producer of petroleum. This is actually the reason why I didn't choose to share the petroleum pipe with the refineries and why there are so many pumps on the petroleum output pipe for light oil cracking all the way to plastic. Last thing that I had to work around in this build was actually water. Because of the distance from the closest place we can place water pumps and the fact that I didn't want to have just rows of pumps connecting everything together, the water pressure drops far enough to require 3 water pumps to be able to sustain the supply in this build. In the end, I was able to find a way to connect all fluid inputs to the right places and also have enough room to get the output fluids at the right volume out of the system into plastic and blue chips. The last piece of this puzzle is the red chip assembly machines, and that is a build that I purposefully left for last because it is the highest number of assembly machines and it's kind of in the middle of the build, and this will, I think, play an important role when it comes to logistics. I start out by filling the south bridge with assembly machines, and that's gonna bring the total number up to 80. The southeastern corner is also exclusively dedicated to red chips, and that's another 52 assembly machines, which puts the total up to 132. And there's also half a bridge left on the east side of the base, where we can squeeze in about 40-ish assembly machines. This still leaves us with about 50 assembly machines which have no real dedicated space, and the reason why I've categorized this last piece of the build as a literal puzzle, because the next part was to roam the entire factory floor and squeeze in one red assembly machine here, one red assembly machine there, just to make sure I don't accidentally use that space up for something else. I also took a bit of time to set up a few extra lanes for iron ore output, and in the end, getting quite creative with placement in some areas, I was able to get up to the total number of required assembly machines. Probably the most painful thing I had to do in this whole series was to destroy myself almost 1 million units of steel. As mentioned earlier in this episode as well, warp modules are going to be replacing speed modules in burners as well, and as such, the build that we have for steel is no longer valid because of the productivity bonuses. What this means is that all of our steel setups will have to be replaced by the regular smelting setups. Fortunately, just half of the mega floor is enough to fulfill our iron needs for this build, and with this out of the way, our factory floor is fully set up to be able to produce warp modules. And I think that this is a great place to make a cut in this episode. In the next one, I will look at turning the resource flow back on and see how this build is doing. We might have to make slight adjustments for everything to work, but I think that's expected. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this new style of editing. Please let me know in the comments what you think of this. If you want to see more episodes like this, or if you want me to go back to my previous format. Until then, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you here next time.